Hello, and you're very welcome to episode 51 of The Fifth Court, a podcast on legal affairs presented by myself, Peter Leonard, barrister.
And myself, Mark Tottenham, barrister and editor of Decisis Law Reports.
Mark, good to see you again, as always. And you will recall last week we completed part 2 of our interview with Mr. Justice Gerard Hogan of the Supreme Court, where we discussed the 50th anniversary of the McGee case and other related case. It was a great interview and really wonderful stuff, wasn't it?
Yeah, and in part 2, for anybody who hasn't listened to it yet, we expanded out into American jurisprudence, the Norris case as well, Roe v. Wade, and Dobbs, which overturned Roe v. Wade. So I think it's definitely one for the archives.
I know, it was a really far-reaching interview. It was really, really good. And actually, before we go to today, you want to make a little announcement about what's upcoming on the Fifth Court.
That's right, because we're very soon going to be discussing sports arbitration. But before then, listeners who are interested in sports arbitration or sports law generally should know that there's going to be a sports law Bar Association event in the Distillery Building on Church Street entitled Fair Play, Fair Start. That's on the 1st of December. And anybody who's interested should look at the Law Library website. Okay, and we have an interview coming up with 2 of our leading sports arbitrators. It's going to be fantastic, folks. If you're into sports law at all, tune in for those interviews. They're great, really, really good. Well, today we are straying slightly outside the bounds of what we normally do on this legal podcast. However, loyal listeners will know that we recently went to the Electric Picnic. Mark, am I saying that again? You did indeed, yes, the Electric Picnic. We were performing,
Okay.
We were there alongside the Wolf Tones. Yeah.
And there we interviewed Guardian Ireland correspondent Rory Carroll about his excellent book, Killing Thatcher. Well, we're in sort of similar territory on this occasion because we're going to be joined by well-known Irish Times journalist Ronan McGreevy, who, along with his fellow journalist Tommy Connon, another Leitrim man, have written about the kidnapping of Don Tidey, which happened 40 years ago this month. And it's a fascinating story and very interesting legal angles as well. It ended up going before the Special Criminal Court, those accused of. And then prior to that, you love this, there was all those issues about evidence, whether evidence was admissible or not. But it is a fascinating social history about, a very difficult time, I think, in recent Irish history.
Yeah, and one which many of us will remember.
So stay tuned and we'll have Ronan shortly. But first, we're going to take a look at 3 cases from the Decisis website that you have identified. Case number 1. In this case, a property was occupied on foot of an agreement for use as a guest house. However, the occupier made modifications to the property in order to let it out as refugee accommodation. The owner sought interlocutory relief. This is the case of Maldua Limited versus Walton, and it is a High Court decision of Judge Liam Kennedy.
Yeah. So, as you said, this is a property that was let out initially as a guest house. I think there may have been a lease license issue, but that's not central to the case. But what happened was that the occupier adapted it for refugee accommodation, and that adapted it in terms of sort of removing walls in the house. Not only did they not have planning permission, they didn't have permission from the owner of the property to make these modifications. So needless to say, the owner wasn't very happy with this and sought interlocutory relief to remove them from the property. But the issue, when it came before the court, the judge said, well, look, if I exclude these people, not only are the lessees themselves living in the property, but there are 36 refugees living there, and if I turf them out, they'll have nowhere to live. And so he said that if they would make the appropriate undertakings, various undertakings to the court, that he wouldn't grant the interlocutory relief.
Okay, so very sensible decision, I suppose. That's the way to look at it. I mean, obviously, 32 refugees being housed, so that was a factor that he had to take into account. Okay, let's move on to case number 2. Proceedings involving a family company were settled, and there was one final payment of 10 million due to the plaintiff. The company was then restructured, and the plaintiff argued that this triggered the final payment. This is the case of Edmond Harty and Company Limited, our Harty versus Harty, I think. And again, it's a decision of Mr. Justice Liam Kennedy. Yeah.
So this is in fact, it was an unlimited company, and it specialised in the production of automatic milking parlour equipment. And it was clearly a very valuable company because there had been a previous dispute among the family members, and the plaintiff had agreed a payout of €44 million for his share in the company. And he'd got all of it except for the last 10 million, which wasn't due to be paid for some time. But there was a clause that said that if the company was sold, that triggered the final payment. Now, the company wasn't technically sold, but it was restructured in such a way that the company didn't retain the same level of capital assets that it had previously. And he said, well, that's counted as a sale. And the court agreed with him.
Okay, so that was a triggering mechanism.
It was a triggering mechanism that
Wow,
it effectively was a sale of the company such that he was entitled to his last 10 million.
Okay.
So I don't think he'll starve.
No, he won't starve. I don't think he'll starve at all. No, very interesting case. Okay, case number 3. Finally, we look at a case where a borrower had been evicted by a mortgagee, but then re-entered the property, and the mortgagee sought interlocutory relief. And this is the case of Mars Capital Finance Limited, DAC versus Quinn, and it's also a decision of Mr. Justice Kennedy. Was there any other judges sitting this week,
I
Mark?
think he was very busy that week, yeah.
He certainly was very busy this week, but anyway.
So there had been an order for possession in the circuit court, and this gave rise to a physical eviction of the mortgagor. I think she actually had to be physically removed and was quite resistant. She then re-entered the property, and they sought injunctive relief to remove her. And she tried to say that the eviction had been unlawful, and the court said no. That although obviously it's a very difficult circumstance to remove somebody from their house, that all of the proper procedures had been followed, and so the eviction was both appropriate and lawful.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, back shortly with Ronan McGreevy.
Silence in the Fifth Court.
Okay, so it is my great pleasure to welcome to the studio an old pal of mine, Ronan McGreevy. Ronan, we go way back to the early 90s.
God,
UCG.
Yeah. Back there in the Napoleonic.
You were a lot
era,
older than me, though. You were a year ahead of me in a diploma in journalism.
That's
remember
right,
that?
yeah,
In the Love Shack at the back of UCG. Do you remember that?
Yeah, God almighty. It's
Those
not
were the
there
days.
anymore. It's all
fancy
very
now.
fancy. That's where I met Tommy, actually, who's the co-author of my book. Yeah, and that's we.
So Tommy was your classmate as well, wasn't that right?
Was, yeah,
and you were two Leitrim boys taking on the world.
That's so to speak.
Okay.
In our own heads, maybe.
You have written a fascinating book, the two of you, Ronan, and we're kind of, as I said in the intro, we're pushing the boundaries a little bit because this is a kind of a legal podcast, but we have ventured into stories like this that were very significant in the history of Ireland and strongly, explore legal themes. And this was all about law and order in the 1980s.
It was.
Okay, let's go back. Okay, it's 1983. It's almost 40 years ago. I think it's just later this month will be the 40th anniversary of Don Tidey's kidnapping. Resident in Rathfarnham in the foothills of the Dublin Mountains. And one day he was trying to drop his daughter to school and things all changed, Ronan.
Yes, well, he was living in Woodtown at that time, which is an exclusive cul-de-sac in the Dublin Mountains. He was driving his daughter Susan to Alexandra College. He was going on to work himself. His son Alistair was following in the car behind. Alistair was working with Don. Don was then the managing director and chairman of Quinsworth. Alistair was working with them at the time. Couple of 100 yards from his house, he saw a Garda approach him. He noticed that the Garda had his hat on, skew-wise. Don is quite a stickler for good dress. Don saw up ahead of him a checkpoint, what he thought was a Garda checkpoint. He let down the window to speak to the guard, and the guard pointed a pistol in his face and forced him out of the car, forced his daughter out of the car, and forced Alistair out of his car. And then they took Don Tidey in another car, drove him to a rendezvous point in Maynooth, where he was transferred to a Comber van and then to a car, and he was kept kidnapped in Dorada Wood outside Ballinamore for the next 23 days.
Okay. And eventually then the Irish Army and the Guards together came upon the site where he was held, and chaos ensued, and we're going to talk about that. And he emerged, safe and sound, but sadly a soldier and a Garda recruit were killed in what happened on that occasion. Let's go back though to put it in context in 1983. We had a previous guest in here, Tim Ryan, who talked about the Kenny report and why the Kenny report wasn't implemented. But he made the point in the course of that interview that people don't seem to realise the pressure that was put on the domestic government in this country at the time due to the ongoing problems associated with the Troubles. Now, the 1980s were a particularly violent period during the course of the Troubles, and it had a major impact in the South. And in the year 1983, there had already been the Shergar kidnapping, for example.
In February 1983,
and so there was a lot of pressure on the state authorities coming from, let's say, subversives from the north. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, I think this is a subject that is underexplored nowadays, is the impact of the Troubles on the South. Most of the coverage is obviously centred on the north, which was the sort of main locus of the activity. But the South was profoundly affected in many, many different ways. Over 100 people were killed in the South during the Troubles. But there was also the huge financial costs of the Troubles to this part of Ireland. We were spending 3 times what the British were spending per capita on security between the Garda and the army. At one stage it was taking €1.07 was the cost of security in the state. And there was a very real threat, which has been kind of forgotten about now, from violent republicanism. You're talking about the INLA and the Provisional IRA, although of course loyalist paramilitaries targeted the South as well, most notably the Dublin Monaghan bombing, but they were never intent on overthrowing the state, whereas the stated aim of the Provisional IRA and the INLA was the overthrow of this state, along with the overthrow of the northern state as well. So there was a huge amount of subversion at that time. I mean, just in the year 1983, there was the kidnapping of Shergar. There was the attempted kidnapping of Galen Weston. There was the shooting, the fatal injury of the prison officer Brian Stack. You had an attempt to flood the South with counterfeit money on the part of the Provisional IRA because they were trying to raise money. Also, there were countless bank robberies and armed robberies carried out by Republicans in the 70s and 80s. And all of it led to a situation whereby, unlike today, Ireland was sort of an international pariah in terms of economic investment. I remember even a couple of weeks ago, I heard Bertie Ahern say that when you went to Silicon Valley or into the United States to look for overseas investors, they just thought Ireland, that's where the Troubles are. Yes. They didn't distinguish between the two places.
And the notion of kidnapping as, you know, as a practice, I suppose, for the Provisional IRA and republicanism generally. I mean, it goes back to obviously Tita Herma in the mid 1970s, and we're talking to you now shortly after the sad passing of Ben Dunne.
That's right.
In 1981. So, I mean, it was something that was used by republicanism as a way of generating funds. Initially, they were into bank robberies, but mechanisms and techniques had been put in place to stop those, and greater security had been applied to banks within the jurisdiction. So kidnapping was an alternative way of trying to raise funds.
Absolutely. Well, probably the most infamous example was Thomas Niedermeyer, who was kidnapped in Belfast in 1972. And there's a fantastic documentary about how his wife, 2 daughters and his son-in-law took their own lives as a result of what happened in 1972. Of course, you had the kidnapping of Tita Herma in 1975. Prior to that, you had the kidnapping of Lord and Lady Donoughmore, which was an incident which is kind of forgotten about now. Then you had Shergar. Then you had Ben Dunne was in 1981, and the allegation is that Ben Dunne Sr. paid a ransom. This is from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Ben Dunne said that himself, that he reckons a ransom had been paid. The IRA are short of money in 1983, and the number of bank robberies that are happening in the state is falling off a cliff because of the activities of the IRA. The security escorts for cash deposits are introduced in the early 1980s. You have CCTV, you have alarms, you have so on. And basically the number of bank robberies decreases by half between 81 and 82, and then almost ends in 1983. So the IRA have to find alternative means of financing.
And another significant event that occurred in 1983 was the Maze breakout, and that was to have play a very important role in this story.
Yes, well, in September 1983, the largest breakout since the Second World War, prisoners occurred in the Maze prison. 38 IRA prisoners managed to break out of the Maze. 19 of them were apprehended within a couple of days, but another 19 of them were on the run for a long time afterwards. About a dozen of them, so we believe, ended up in Leitrim as guests of John Joe McGirl, who was the vice chairman of Sinn Féin, one of the founders of the Provisional IRA. He had a network of safe houses outside Baldamore in the sort of hinterland area, which was a strongly Republican area. And the best estimate is between 11 and 12 of them ended up there. We know this for a fact because Jerry Kelly has it in his own book that himself and Dermot Finucane, who was the brother of Pat Finucane, were were kept there. Jerry Adams has come down to Leitrim several times and spoken about the fact that John Joe McGirl had put up quite a few of the maze escapees.
Yeah, okay. And so this story, let's go back to the Don Tidey, specifically to the Don Tidey kidnapping. So after he was taken in Rathfarnham in the foothills of the Dublin Mountains, as you say, and from Woodtown, he was then brought initially to Kildare, but then very quickly he ended up in Leitrim. Isn't that the case? We know that subsequently.
Yeah, well, he estimates himself. Obviously, he was, by this stage, he had been subject to almost complete sensory deprivation. He was, his ears were bandaged and there was blindfold on his eyes. But he reckons that on the night of the 24th of November 1983, which is basically the night that the day that he had been captured, he was taken to a place, he doesn't know where, we now know it to be Drogheda Wood, and that's where he remained for the next 23 days. Now, to go back to, you're wondering what this has all got to do with the Maze prison escape. Well, the allegation is that it was the Maze prison, 4 Maze prison escapees who were responsible for holding him there for the duration of his time, and also for the incidents which occurred when he was rescued.
Now, you talk about the figure of John Joe McGirl, who was at one stage, I think back in 1957, was elected to the Dáil.
That's right.
Was, involved in the border campaign back in the day, in the late 50s, early 60s. And then when the split came, went with the Provisionals and was a founding member of the Provisional IRA.
That's right.
And was very active. Yes. And he seemed to have a network of safe houses for various people, for the people who came out of the maze. They ultimately ended up in Leitrim and were looked after locally in a very rural part of Ireland. Will you describe how rural this is?
Well, the shorthand for the Tidey kidnapping was that it occurred in Ballinamore, but actually it didn't. It occurred in a place called Corralehan, which is 5 miles outside Ballinamore, but a place you wouldn't find unless you were really going there. I mean, you wouldn't have a reason to pass through it, for instance. And there's a church there called Corralehan Church, and then there's about another mile down the road from that, there are a whole network of forests in that area. At the time, they were pretty new forests, because the successive governments had thought that Leitrim was only good for forestry. So he ended up in a very isolated place that had been prepared in advance. It's important to state that. So they were expecting to kidnap somebody, and it's not a place you would have found in a month of Sundays unless you were a local.
When you say he was blindfolded and had his ears bound and was kept in a wood, was he put in slightly more comfort when he arrived in Leitrim, or was he effectively in similar position for most of his time there?
The conditions he endured were unimaginable. He was bound hand and foot and chained to a tree for 23 days. At night, he was basically put into a hole in the ground, a depression in the ground, which had tarpaulin over it, and the water would seep in through the plastic, and he knew it was balanced on his nose. He says in all his time, the 23 days he was there, he never saw the place where he was kept. There was a couple of times when he had his blindfold taken off. Once when there was a photograph taken of him for the Evening Herald newspaper to prove that he was still alive. But I mean, what he endured was just shocking, really. And
talking about the blindfolding, crucially, when ultimately this matter comes to the Special Criminal Court down the line, and he gives evidence, he had to come out and say, he couldn't identify any of the people who had, held him hostage in Drogheda Wood. Isn't that the case?
Well, it's interesting. He and I had a conversation about all of this, and originally he said that he wouldn't know whether the person in the dock at that time was Bick McFarlane had been at Drogheda Woods or not. But then he changed his mind. He says he couldn't know. And he couldn't know because he never saw the people who had captured him. In fact, he never had an opportunity to see them. Here, he says that they have border accents, northern accents, but, that's hardly, narrowing it down. So, no, he never saw any of the people who kidnapped him. He said when he attended the trial of Bick McFarlane, the man in the dock was a stranger.
And before we get on to the trial, I mean, obviously, as Peter said, there was a very chaotic release operation by the Garda and the army. Could you just briefly outline what happened there?
Yes, well, on the afternoon of the 16th of December 1983, a party known as Rudolph 5, there were 10 search parties named Rudolph 1 to 10 because it was coming up close to Christmas. There was about 25 men involved. They came across the hideout in the middle of Dorada Wood, and one of the recruit Gardaí who was involved called out to two men they could see in a clearing who were wearing army fatigues and had weapons, were cleaning their weapons. Who are you? When they didn't get a response. And then suddenly the kidnappers opened up with semi-automatic rifles and killed Private Patrick Kelly and recruit Garda Gary Sheehan. They then detonated a stun grenade and used the sort of chaos to escape the woods, taking with them 7 Irish security force personnel, Gardaí and soldiers hostage. They marched them across a field, told them to keep walking out onto a road and don't look around. They then doubled back, got into a car that had the key in the ignition, and one of the kidnappers got into the boot of the car. They started firing indiscriminately at Gardaí and army personnel as they drove down the road. They shot Detective Sergeant Tony Keller, who shot in both legs. He survived. They almost shot Don Tidey as well, who at this stage had made his own escape and found himself in the path of the people who had kidnapped him. Eventually, they were stopped at a checkpoint. There was an exchange of gunfire, and they jumped into a field and disappeared into a huge plantation on the Cavan-Leitrim border and were never seen again.
A slightly controversial aspect of this, Ronan, was the involvement of recruit Gardaí. Gardaí who were training in Templemore. They needed a lot of personnel, obviously, to comb this huge area of County Leitrim, difficult terrain, woodland, boggy woodland. This is in the middle of winter. I mean, it was really, really challenging. And they brought all these young trainee Gardaí up. Was that appropriate?
Well, that's a debate that has been going on since that day. There were 98 recruits in total who were involved. They were involved, A, because they were young and fit and they were able to cover a lot of terrain. And 2, they were enthusiastic, but they'd only been there 3 months. And there's a school of thought that says that it was no place to bring naive, basically, recruit Gardaí. But then the counter-argument to that is that Private Patrick Kelly was an experienced soldier who had done 3 tours, 2 tours of Lebanon, 1 of Cyprus, and he was armed and he got killed as well. So there was no, I think really, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but all I can tell you is that the people that we spoke to in relation to the book who were there have no regrets about being there.
The nation went into mourning after the death of these 2 individuals, and huge funerals in Mullingar?
Well, it was in
Westmeath, Moat and Westmeath, and Carrickmacross.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And, I mean, the outpouring of grief, and, I mean, the state was shocked, really, by what had happened, and that servants of the state had been attacked in such a way and had been killed in such an indiscriminate firing, etc.
Well, it was a shocking event in the Troubles when you think about it. I mean, the Provisional IRA's narrative that it was taking on the British state, that there were these brave patriots taking on the British state, and where in fact they had been taking on the Irish state as well. Obviously, they had a rule, Standing Order Number 8, which said that they were not to get involved in targeting Irish security officers, but we know for a fact that they did. I mean, they had at that stage killed 4 Gardaí. The INLA had killed, just the year previously, had killed a couple of Gardaí. So there was a lot of that stuff going on. And one thing another reason that there was such consternation in Ireland was because the day after Private Kelly and recruit Garda Sheehan were killed, the IRA detonated a bomb outside Harrods, killing 6 people. So those 2 events became very, very quickly synonymous in the public mind with the sort of depths of depravity that the IRA would stoop to at that stage.
And you say that also led to some sort of burgeoning agreement between Margaret Thatcher, then obviously Prime Minister of Britain, and Gareth Fitzgerald Taoiseach here, in the sense that both had lost people at the same time, and Thatcher with the fact that an Irish soldier and an Irish Garda recruit had been killed, suddenly felt some sort of
Empathy,
connection and empathy, and that led to
the Anglo-Irish
agreement.
Well, it's a very significant detail in the book, and that's why at the time, although we've kind of forgotten about now, Harrods and Dorada Wood were kind of seen became synonymous with each other very, very quickly. And prior to what had happened at Dorada Wood, Irish Taoiseach, including Charlie Haughey, Jack Lynch and Gareth Fitzgerald, had a very difficult time explaining to Margaret Thatcher that the Provisional IRA was also an enemy of the Irish state. But after Dorada Wood, there was no doubt in her mind about this. And as a result of that, you have, now there's many a slip between cup and lip, but within 2 years you have the Anglo-Irish agreement. And Thatcher realises that you're going to get nowhere without proper security cooperation. And this is why the events at Dorada Wood are actually a very significant development in what would become the peace process.
Ronan, the book is brilliantly written, and, you know, the descriptions you give of how Don Tidey was found, the gun battles that led to his release, and then other events in Claremorris. We won't get you to go into that, and, you know, that was probably a less glorious, outing for the Defence Forces here, or the Guards, I suppose. But in terms of, let's say, after the aftermath, in terms of prosecutions, there was about 6 people prosecuted, I think, immediately after that, but not the people that were responsible for shooting the guard and the soldier.
Yes, there was several prosecutions as a result of the of what happened at Dorada Wood. One of them was of John Kernan, who was the local person in Dorada Wood, who actually owned Dorada Wood. He got I think it was a 7 years sentence, 5 of them suspended. There was a guy called Michael Burke, who was one of the original kidnappers who kidnapped Don Tidey in Dublin. He got a lengthy sentence. And there was a guy called Kelly, who was also prosecuted down in Kerry. He had hired a car on behalf of the IRA for the kidnapping. But these were essentially peripheral characters in the saga. There's never been a prosecution in relation to the kidnapping of Don Tidey in Dorada Woods, nor for the murder of Sheehan and Kelly.
You say there hasn't been a prosecution. There was an attempted prosecution of Big McFarlane, and that first came before the courts in 1998. What was it that 15 years after the events led to Big McFarlane being prosecuted?
Well, Big McFarlane was one of the Maze escapees. He had been jailed for life in 1976 for the Bayardo Bar massacre, in which he and 3 IRA volunteers had shot up basically a loyalist pub on the Shankill Road and detonated a bomb, killing 5 people. He had been in jail in 1983. He escaped with the Maze escapees.
And he was famously the officer commanding during the hunger strikes.
Yes, he was the officer commanding during the hunger strikes, yes, as well. So he was quite a big cheese in the Maze prison politics at the time. In 1998, he was released early. This is before, it should be said, the Good Friday Agreement, which was signed in April of that year. But there had been a number of prisoner releases prior to that as sort of confidence building exercises, including him. He had served approximately, he had been in jail from 1976, but he had been out after he escaped the Maze until he was arrested in Amsterdam in 1986 along with Jerry Kelly. So in 1998 he was boarding a bus. He was on his way from Dublin back to Belfast, where when Garda got on a bus outside Dundalk and arrested him and charged him with the unlawful kidnapping of Don Tidey. And this ended up in a 10-year saga in which essentially the case against him collapsed in 2008 as a result of...
Can you take us through that, Ronan? Because evidence went missing. Crucial evidence went missing.
Well, in 1998, I mean, it was a very, very long saga. Essentially, the state's evidence was based on their belief that they had his fingerprints relating to items that were found at the in Dorada Wood, which was basically a cooking pot and a carton of milk, which had the date, ironically enough, of the 16th of December in 1983. And this case went to court, but immediately there was two successive appeals, both of which went to both the High Court and the Supreme Court. The problem was the kernel of the state's evidence was these fingerprints, but the items involved had been removed from storage in the Phoenix Park and they couldn't be found.
When had they last been seen?
Well, apparently the last time they had been seen was in 1993. This is there was some evidence given in the court case that they had been there in 1993, but between 1993 and 1998 they had gone missing. Now, cock up or conspiracy, we don't know who got rid of them or why it happened. Apparently the storage facility in question was turned into a library, so they were they just went missing. But it was the state's case basically that you didn't need the evidence themselves, you didn't need the items themselves to prosecute the case because you had the photographs of the fingerprints,
and photographic evidence.
Yes, and this is now I'm talking to an audience who knows this better than me, but you don't bring, if there are fingerprints on a door that are germane to a case, you don't bring the door into court, right? I mean, you use the fingerprint evidence and you say, is this, Joe Bloggs' fingerprints, and then you give them to the defence solicitor and he examines them and so on and so forth. But this went back and forward.
Mark looks horrified here, Ronan.
Well,
certainly, the real thing.
Certainly you would often make arrangements for the defence to have their own inspection, and you certainly need to be satisfied with the procedures that were used. But but the argument they made obviously was that once the copy had been made by a reliable fingerprint examiner, presumably then they could rely on that for the prosecution.
And that worked in the Supreme Court, didn't it?
Yeah,
Adrian Harty would be the presiding judge.
So the case went to the Supreme Court, and Adrian Hardiman said that that there was sufficient evidence for the case to go ahead, and also said that McFarlane hadn't given a sufficiently credible account of his whereabouts between 1983 and 1986 when he was recaptured and brought to the maze. So the trial was given a go ahead in 2006, and then another case is brought, this time again to the High Court and to the Supreme Court, where again McFarlane's lost, and the case went ahead in.
And this was on the grounds of delay, is
yes,
that right?
That's right. It went ahead in June the 11th, 2008. It should be said that the Supreme Court judges agreed there had been a delay, but they didn't think it had been an unreasonable one. So the case went ahead then on the 11th of June. Now there was two, as one of the prosecuting barristers said, there was two wings to their case. I mean, they were like a bird flying with two wings. The one was the fingerprint evidence, but the other was critically a confession that McFarlane is said to have made in Dundalk prison, where he says, I was there, but I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm paraphrasing here. I can give you the direct quote, but he said basically, I was here, but don't ask me to say anything about it. And
just to interrupt you there, Ron, this is fantastic. The detail is incredible, and it's incredible in the book. But this was the Special Criminal Court, so it was three courts. The presiding judge was Judge Paul Butler at the time, and for the prosecution was the late Edward Comyn, and defending McFarlane was our colleague Hugh Hartnett.
Yes.
And essentially, that was the issue. This evidence that had been recorded or taken down in Dundalk Garda station, the so-called admission from Big McFarlane, was that admissible?
Yes, that's the question. So the exact quote was, I was there, you can prove that, but I will not talk about it. And then he later said, I'm prepared for the big one. And under cross-examination from Edward Coleman, senior counsel for the DPP, McFarlane actually denied it, ever uttered those words in Dundalk Garda station. And he says, I did not, my lord. So that was the central part of the evidence. But crucially, the trial judge believed that the evidence that he gave, this admission that he had allegedly made in Dundalk Garda station had not been recorded, wasn't done under the procedures that were available in 1998, and that the actual interview date itself hadn't been the date hadn't been recorded either. So once that evidence was struck out, the second part of the evidence couldn't fly either. So the prosecution case collapsed, and McFarlane was a free man, and he eventually sued the state for the delay in the prosecution, and in 2010 he was awarded €15,000.
€15,000. And a curious little thing, only a small, I suppose, a trite issue, but you make the point in the book that when he was before the Special Criminal Court, every time he was asked a question, he replied, he referred to the judge as "my lord," which was highly unusual for people from the Republican tradition.
Well, no, they didn't. It was only in the 1980s that they were forced really to recognise the Irish courts. Before that, they wouldn't recognise the courts, but then the judges were just handing them down draconian sentences as a result of that. So they decided to, be a little bit more emollient.
But effectively, because of the ruling of inadmissibility of the evidence of the so-called confession, I suppose we should say, basically Edward Common, and I think Fergal Foley was the junior counsel in that case. Yeah. They basically went in and said, look, the state can't advance its case. Wasn't that it,
they were
basically?
offering no further evidence, and that was it, really. Okay. And so he was a free man.
Okay. And Ronan, can I just bring you to, as we mentioned at the start, you're a proud Leitrim man. And in the book, you make a lot about Ballinamore. Yes. And I know Tommy is actually from Ballinamore. Yes, yeah. And I wondered, did this kind of linger with you as a young man growing up? We were about the same age, would have been early teens in the 1980s. This kind of association with Ballinamore, because there was a celebrated or very famous Today Tonight programme that was subsequently recorded, which I remember well.
Anybody who's seen it remembers it well, and that's the problem. So,
do you remember it, Mark?
I don't.
You didn't see that, Brendan O'Brien, but the famous scene. Will you tell us about the famous scene outside the church?
So there was a famous scene outside the church in which Brendan O'Brien, who was the doyen of sort of Irish broadcast journalism at that stage, he had been there in Dorado Wood before Christmas. He decided to go in early January. He had a lot of questions that he wanted answered. For instance, why did these guys manage to escape the so-called Ring of Steel, as it was known at the time, with all the Garda and army personnel that had been around? But anyway, the other thing he wanted to find out is whether or not there was residual support for the provisional IRA in Ballinamore or in Leitrim. So he goes to Corralehan Church. Now, bear in mind, Corralehan Church is actually outside Ballinamore. It's 5 miles outside Ballinamore. And this isn't a minor point. It's actually a major point, because Ballinamore itself is quite a conservative town. It's very Fine Gael. It's very it's a typical Irish country town. Whereas the hinterlands around it were much more Republican, and that's where John Joe McGirl would have got most of his support from. But anyway, they went to Corralehan Church, which is the closest church. It's basically at the back of Dorado Wood. And Brendan O'Brien had one question for the people involved. If you knew that Don Tidey was being hidden in the woods, would you inform the Gardaí? To which every single person said no comment, or as it was at the time, no comment. Yeah, no comment to make.
No comment to make.
Was,
this became like, this was the phrase that
it used to haunt us for years.
I mean, us Dubs were all saying it as well, you know.
It was funny, because I was in school in Longford at the time, and I was my maths teacher at the time, and he says to me one day, he says, McGreevy, I suppose, Mr. McGreevy, that'd be no comment. And of course, I didn't know what he was talking about, but I subsequently found out. And of course, there was a famous song at the time that Christy Moore recorded called The Ballad of Ballinamore, which everybody in Leitrim knew. Leitrim's a funny place, or it's a strange and a troubled land. All the men are in the IRS, or all the women are in common demand. So, I mean, people are making a joke of it, but obviously it's a very serious matter.
Yes.
But we go into this in a great deal.
And that's what I want to. So that is kind of, as I say, you guys, sons of Leitrim.
Yeah.
It's part of writing this book, and it is an incredible piece of history, Ronan. So, you know, but it's almost a sort of a social commentary on Leitrim, and kind of retrospectively addressing an association that was given to that part of Leitrim all those years ago that you and Tommy don't feel is merited.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can understand from an outsider's point of view why they would draw some conclusions that Leitrim was a very Republican county at the time. In fact, it wasn't. I mean, there's no denying that there was a significant number of people who were prepared to help the provisional IRA, but that didn't make it a Provo county. I mean, Sinn Féin only received 5% of the vote in Leitrim in the 1981 general election. John Joe McGirl failed to get Joe McDonald, one of the kidnappers, one of the hunger strikers, elected in 1981, despite bringing his soon-to-be widow around the county to try and drum up support. So, I mean, the county was unfairly portrayed. But I'll just say one thing as well. Brendan O'Brien also went to the town of Ballinamore, and a lot of people were very, very afraid to talk, and particularly they were afraid to condemn the IRA. And except one guy, a guy called Brian Toolan, who's a solicitor, yes. Gabriel Toolan's very long-established solicitor's firm in Ballinamore, he condemned the IRA and said that local people needed to stand up to them. As a result of that, the windows of the solicitor's office, every single one of the windows, front windows windows was smashed a couple of nights after that.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
It is an incredible episode in Irish history. Ronan, you tell it brilliantly. Yourself and Tommy, you tell it brilliantly. The detail is fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed. It's probably not the right word, but it is the right word. It's so well written. I really enjoyed going over this story that I knew so well all those years ago. And the retrospective on Leitrim I found particularly interesting, and what you had to say about your county and the intimidation that occurred at that period of time. And we're a long way away from that period of time now. But it should never be forgotten, I think.
No, I completely agree with you. I think it's very important that it's never forgotten. I mean, there is a memorial to John McGurl in Ballinamore. There's also a memorial walk, would you believe, which is part of the Ballinamore Family Festival every year. So, I mean, his side of the aisle, so to speak, doesn't forget about it, but it's time the people of Leitrim stood up. And what Tommy and I would love to see emerging as a result of this book and as a result of the 40th anniversary commemorations is a memorial to Kelly and Sheehan in our county.
Two were killed. Absolutely. Ronan, I don't know how we follow that with a question, but it sounds a little bit trite, doesn't it? Mark,
I think we'll ask it anyway.
Give it a lash. Go on, give it a lash.
Yeah. Well, the question we always ask our guests, do you have a book or a film or other work of art that you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
With a legal theme?
Not necessarily, but as there tend to be people with a legal interest listening. So,
well, I love 12 Angry Men, right. And I love the way that person who stands out from the consensus and with the sheer force of his logic and the sheer force of his argument is able to turn around everybody else who has taken for granted what happened. I have watched that movie many times, and I think there are great lessons for us out of it.
I hope you've also watched the Tony Hancock spoof of it as well.
I haven't, but it's
definitely worth it.
I was going to say, Mark, you have a picture of Henry Fonda on your wall, don't you? And you have a little look at it and kind of genuflect as you leave. Ronan, thank you very much for coming in. I have so enjoyed this interview, and it is so informative. And I'm giving a huge recommendation to your book. And just give me the full title again. It's published by Penguin. It's called The Kidnapping, a hostage, a desperate manhunt, and a bloody rescue that shocked Ireland. Ronan, thank you for being a guest on The Fifth Court.
The Fifth Court will adjourn until next week.
So that's all from this edition of The Fifth Court. We hope you have enjoyed it. Can we say a huge thank you to our guest, author Ronan McGreevy, for coming in and telling us about his book, The Kidnapping, a fascinating story from the 1980s, early 1980s in Ireland, and a gripping interview, Mark.
Yeah, and it's sort of reminder of just how difficult the troubles were, not just north of the border, but also in this part of the country.
Yes, no, absolutely. So before we go, I'd like to say a big thank you to our producer, Conal O'Moroyne, and also to Lee Brennan, who's done such a fabulous job on recording this show, and the Dublin Podcast Studios, where we broadcast from. So from me, Peter Leonard.
Myself, Mark Tottenham.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon in The Fifth Court.